They called it a retirement gift, one last name to clear the ledger. He opened the envelope and looked into a mirror of the life he walked out on. The target isn't a rival, it's his son, the only thing he ever did right. Tonight, he is not working for the family. Tonight, the family dies. They tell you the first one is the hardest. They're wrong. It's the last one, because by the time you reach the end of the line, you finally have something to lose. Elias Thorne is a ghost in a suit. For 30 years, he's been the man the Moretti family calls when they want a problem to vanish. He's done his time. He's earned his exit. But in this city, nobody just walks away. When his boss, Sal Moretti, slides a manila envelope across a scarred wooden table, he calls it a retirement gift. Elias opens it, expecting a name he doesn't know. Instead, he stares into a mirror of his own younger self. The target isn't a rival mobster. It's the son he walked out on to keep his hands clean. Now, the cleanest hitman in New York has a choice. Finish the job and lose his soul, or save his son and ignite a war he can't win. Like and subscribe as we dive into this amazing story. The rain in Queens didn't wash anything away. It just turned the city's grit into a slick, reflective coat of oil. Elias Thorne sat in the shadows of a charcoal gray sedan, his eyes fixed on a second-floor window above a cramped Italian bakery. The engine was off, the heater long dead, but Elias didn't feel the chill. He hadn't felt much of anything for 30 years. In his lap lay the manila envelope, the edges damp from his touch. Inside, the photograph of Julian stared back, a face that carried his own jawline but none of his weariness. The bakery door creaked open, spilling a warm, golden light onto the wet pavement. Julian stepped out, dusting flour from a dark green apron. He was laughing, tossing a stray piece of bread to a mangy street dog that hovered near the trash. Elias watched the boy's hands. They were thick and calloused, but they weren't stained. Those hands made things. They didn't break them. Elias trailed him from a distance of 2 blocks, a ghost haunting the living. He watched Julian stop at a newsstand, exchanging a high five with the vendor, an old man who smiled as if Julian were the highlight of his shift. He watched his son help a woman maneuver a stroller over a jagged curb. These were the small, invisible threads of a life built on kindness, a currency Elias had never traded in. Every step Julian took felt like a physical blow to Elias' chest. For 2 decades, Elias had told himself that abandonment was a form of protection. If he wasn't there, the shadow of the Moretti family couldn't find the boy. He had traded the role of a father for the role of a guardian from afar, sending anonymous envelopes of cash that Julian likely thought were government grants or miracles. Seeing him now, vibrant and untainted, Elias realized he hadn't just saved Julian. He had been replaced by a world that was better than him. Julian turned into a small park, the Empire State Building looming in the distance like a silent judge. He sat on a bench and pulled out a sketchbook. Elias moved closer, slipping behind a thick oak tree, his hand instinctively reaching for the cold steel of the suppressed pistol tucked into his waistband. The weight of the weapon felt obscene in this space. From his vantage point, Elias could see what Julian was drawing. It wasn't the skyline or the trees. It was the people, the lovers walking hand in hand, the tired workers heading home. Julian was a student of humanity, while Elias was its janitor, cleaning up the messes the mob left behind. A sudden flash of movement caught Elias' eye. A black SUV drifted slowly past the park entrance, its tinted windows rolled down just an inch. Elias froze. He knew that car. He knew the driver. Sal Moretti hadn't just given him a target, he had put a tail on the hitman. The retirement gift was a test of loyalty, and the Proctors were already watching for a failure. Julian looked up from his sketch, sensing a presence, his eyes scanning the tree line. For a split second, their gazes almost met. Elias pressed his back against the rough bark, holding his breath, his heart hammering a rhythm he hadn't felt since his first kill. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was terrified that his son would finally see him, not as a memory, but as the monster he had become. The SUV moved on, but the air remained heavy. The peaceful life Julian had built was a glass house, and Elias was the stone. He looked down at his hands, trembling slightly in the dark. He had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of the exit, But as he watched Julian pack his bag and head toward a subway entrance, Elias knew there was no clean way out of this. To save the boy, he would have to destroy the only peace Julian had ever known. He would have to become the shadow his son feared, just to keep the real darkness at bay. The buzzing of the burner phone on the passenger seat sounded like a rattlesnake in the quiet of the car. Elias didn't reach for it immediately. He watched Julian disappear down the stairs of the 7 train station, the boy's yellow windbreaker a fading spark of color in the subterranean gray. Only when the iron gate rattled shut did Elias pick up the device. Elias. The voice was like gravel grinding in a silk bag. Sal Morty didn't wait for a greeting. He didn't ask about the weather or the traffic in Queens. Sal spoke with the heavy, unearned intimacy of a man who owned the air you breathed. "You're slowing down, my friend. It's been 6 hours since we sat at the diner. Usually, by now, I'm getting a text from a burner telling me the trash has been collected." Elias looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The shadows under his eyes looked like bruises. "The target is cautious, Sal. He's got a routine, but he's observant. I'm finding the right window. You taught me yourself. Patience is the difference between a ghost and a headline." There was a long, chilling silence on the other end. Elias could hear the faint clink of a glass, the exhale of expensive cigar smoke. He could almost see Sal sitting in the back of the Raven Club, surrounded by men who didn't have souls, only price tags. Patience is a virtue, Elias, but hesitation is a disease, and in our line of work it's contagious. Sal's tone shifted, dropping an octave into a register that felt like a blade pressed against the throat. "I sent Vinny and the boys out for a drive. They mentioned they saw your sedan parked near a park in Flushing. They said you looked contemplative, like you were watching a movie instead of doing a job." Elias tightened his grip on the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. The black SUV from earlier hadn't been a coincidence. It was a leash. Sal wasn't just checking in, he was marking his territory. "I'm setting the stage, Sal. You want it clean or you want it loud. If you want loud, send Vinny. If you want it gone, let me work." "I want it done," Sal snapped, the mask of congeniality finally slipping. "The board is moving, Elias. This kid, this baker, he's a loose thread. He's tied to things that could burn us both if the wrong people start tugging. I gave this to you as a courtesy, a way to finish your career with the ultimate proof of loyalty. Don't make me rethink my generosity." The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Sal didn't know the boy was Elias' son, or did he? In the world of the Morty family, information was the only currency that mattered more than blood. If Sal knew, this wasn't a hit. It was an execution of Elias' spirit. If he didn't know, it was only a matter of time before the cleanup crew realized why the silent hand was suddenly trembling. "By morning," Elias said, his voice a hollow echo of the man he used to be. "Good, because Vinny is getting impatient, and you know how he gets when he's bored. He starts looking for other things to break." The line went dead. Elias stared at the blank screen of the phone before tossing it back onto the seat. The city lights outside seemed harsher now, bleeding into the wet pavement like neon wounds. He had bought himself 12 hours. 12 hours to figure out how to kill a ghost without shedding a drop of his son's blood. He put the car into gear, the engine letting out a low, predatory growl. He wasn't going to his apartment. He was going back to the subway station. The time for watching from the shadows was over. The time for the haunting had begun. The lock on Julian's third-floor walk-up was a joke, a standard deadbolt that yielded to Elias' tension wrench in less than 5 seconds. He stepped inside, the door clicking shut with a finality that felt like a gavel. The apartment smelled of yeast, old paper, and a hint of vanilla. It was a clean smell. A world away from the metallic tang of cordite and wet pavement that usually followed Elias home. He moved through the dark with the practiced silence of a predator, his eyes adjusting to the dim blue glow of the streetlights filtering through thin curtains. The space was small, cluttered with the artifacts of a life Elias had never been invited to share. There were stacks of charcoal drawings on a scratched wooden table, a half-finished cup of coffee, and a row of worn-out boots by the radiator. Julian was asleep in the adjacent room, his breathing heavy and rhythmic. Elias stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the rise and fall of his son's chest. The boy looked younger in sleep, the tension of the day smoothed out of his brow. In his hand, Elias still carried the suppressed pistol, its weight a shameful reminder of why he was there. He tucked it into the small of his back, hiding the metal behind his leather jacket. He didn't wake him gently. He couldn't afford the luxury of a soft landing. Elias reached out and pressed a gloved hand firmly over Julian's mouth, his other hand pinning the boy's shoulder to the mattress. Julian's eyes snapped open, wide and white with terror. He thrashed for a second, a muffled cry dying in his throat, before the cold, steady pressure of Elias' grip forced him into a paralyzed silence. "Don't scream," Elias whispered, his voice a low, vibrating rasp. "If you scream, I can't help you. If you fight, we both die tonight. Do you understand?" Julian stared up at him, his pupils blown wide. He managed a frantic nod. Elias slowly retracted his hand but stayed close, looming over the bed like a grim reaper. Julian scrambled backward, his back hitting the headboard, his breath coming in jagged, terrified gulps. "Who are you?" Julian choked out, his voice cracking. "What do you want? I don't have any money, the bakery barely." "I don't want your money, Julian." The use of his name made the boy freeze. The fear in his eyes shifted, replaced by a flickering, painful recognition. He squinted through the shadows, searching the jagged lines of Elias' face, tracing the familiar architecture of a ghost he had only seen in faded Polaroids tucked into the back of a junk drawer. "You," Julian breathed, the word carrying 20 years of resentment and confusion. You're him." "There's no time for that," Elias said, his tone sharpening. He couldn't let the emotion in. If he let the dam break, they were both dead. "Listen to me very carefully. You are being watched, not just by me. Men are coming, Julian. Men who don't care about your bakery or your drawings. They see you as a loose end and they intend to cut it." "What are you talking about? I haven't done anything." "It doesn't matter what you've done. It matters who I am," Elias said, standing straight. He looked toward the window, checking the street below. "You have to leave. Now, pack a bag, nothing heavy, no electronics, no phone. If you touch a cell tower, they'll find us in minutes." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Julian hissed, his fear turning into a desperate, shaking anger. "You show up after 2 decades, break into my home, and tell me my life is over. You're a murderer. I know what you are." Elias turned back, his expression as cold as a winter grave. "You're right. I am a murderer. And right now, I'm the only one who can keep you from becoming a victim. They gave me the contract to kill you, Julian. If I don't finish it, they'll send someone who will enjoy the work. Now get out of the bed." The silence that followed was heavy, filled only with the distant hum of the city. Julian looked at the man he had hated for a lifetime, then at the open door. The reality of the shadow world Elias inhabited was finally bleeding into the room, cold and inescapable. Julian stood up, his legs trembling. "Where are we going?" "To a place where ghosts go to disappear," Elias said, handing him a duffel bag from the closet. "And if we're lucky, we'll get there before the sun realizes we're still alive." The descent down the back fire escape was a frantic metal percussion against the brick of the alleyway. Julian moved with the stumbling uncertainty of a man whose world had just collapsed, while Elias flowed behind him, eyes scanning the rooftops and the mouth of the alley. The air tasted of wet soot and coming snow. "Keep your head down," Elias hissed, shoving Julian toward the shadow of a rusted dumpster. "Walk, don't run. If you run, you're a target. If you walk, you're just another nobody in New York." They had only made it 30 yards toward the parked sedan when Elias felt the hair on his arms stand up. It was a familiar electric hum, the sensation of a predator entering the same hunting ground. He stopped, grabbing Julian by the scabbard of his jacket and pulling him hard into a recessed doorway filled with the stench of sour trash. "Stay here, don't breathe, don't look out," Elias commanded. "What is it?" Julian whispered, his voice trembling. Elias didn't answer. He peeked around the edge of the stone archway. At the far end of the street, a lean figure stepped out from behind a parked delivery truck. He was draped in a long, tattered gray coat that caught the wind like wings, earning him the name, the Vulture. In the underworld, Vinny was the man they sent when they wanted the kill to be felt. He didn't just pull triggers, he harvested pieces. The Vulture was carrying a heavy tactical case, his gait predatory and rhythmic. He wasn't looking for Elias, he was looking for the apartment window Elias had just vacated. Sal hadn't waited for the 12-hour deadline. He had sent the insurance policy. Elias knew the math. If he stepped out now and engaged, the noise would bring every patrol car in the precinct. And if he missed, Julian was a dead man. He had to be surgical. He leaned close to Julian, the scent of the bakery still clinging to the boy's clothes, a heartbreaking contrast to the violence about to unfold. "Count to 60, Elias breathed. "If I'm not back, run to the subway, don't look back." Elias vanished into the dark before Julian could protest. He didn't follow the street. He scaled a low chain-link fence, cutting through a vacant lot to get behind the Vulture's path. He moved with a grace that defied his age, his boots making no sound on the cracked asphalt. The Vulture had reached the base of Julian's building, setting his case down to assemble a compact carbine. He was whistling a low, tuneless melody. Elias closed the distance, a shadow merging with a shadow. He didn't pull his gun. The crack of a shot, even suppressed, was too much of a risk in the narrow canyon of the street. Instead, he drew a thin, weighted garrote from his sleeve. He struck when the Vulture reached for his scope. Elias looped the wire over the younger man's head in one fluid motion, bracing his knee against the small of the Vulture's back, and pulling with the mechanical strength of a man who had done this 1,000 times. The Vulture thrashed, his hands clawing at his throat, his boots scraping against the pavement. He was strong, fueled by the panic of a dying animal, but Elias was a pillar of granite. He ignored the fingers tearing at his own wrists, the desperate gasps for air that sounded like a broken bellows. "Die quiet," Elias thought, his teeth bared in a silent snarl. "Die quiet so he doesn't have to hear you." After a minute that felt like an hour, the Vulture went limp. Elias held the tension for 10 seconds longer just to be sure, then eased the body down behind a stack of wooden pallets. He took the carbine, broke it down, and threw the bolt into a sewer grate 2 doors down. When Elias returned to the doorway, Julian was huddled against the bricks, his eyes squeezed shut, his lips moving in a silent prayer. He looked up as Elias approached, his eyes darting to the fresh red welts on Elias' wrists. "Is he?" Julian started, his voice failing. "He's gone," Elias said, his voice flat and devoid of triumph. He grabbed Julian's arm, hauling him toward the car. "But there are more. Sal doesn't stop at one. He's going to turn this city into a cage, and we're running out of exits." He shoved Julian into the passenger seat and slammed the door. As Elias slid behind the wheel and turned the ignition, he caught his own reflection in the mirror. He looked like the monster Julian accused him of being. He put the car in gear and drifted away from the curb, leaving the Vulture's cooling body in the shadows of the life his son had worked so hard to build. The sedan hurtled through the industrial skeleton of Long Island City, the skyline of Manhattan mocking them from across the black ribbon of the East River. Inside the cabin, the silence was a physical weight, heavier than the engine's hum. Julian stared at the dashboard, his hands shaking so violently he had to tuck them under his thighs. The adrenaline was fatting, leaving behind a cold. Sharp clarity that cut deeper than any knife. "You knew my name," Julian said. It wasn't a question. His voice was brittle, echoing off the glass. "You didn't just find me today. You knew where I worked. You knew I liked the park by the bridge. You've been watching me." Elias kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel despite the raw, red garrote burns stinging his wrists. "I stayed away to keep the world I live in from touching yours. Tonight, that failed." "To keep me safe," Julian let out a jagged, hollow laugh that sounded like breaking glass. He finally turned in his seat, his eyes burning with a sudden, ferocious heat. "Is that what you call it? You didn't stay away to protect me. You stayed away because you're a coward. You preferred the company of monsters and the money of murderers over being a father. You let me grow up thinking I was a mistake, an accident that a ghost walked out on." "I am a monster, Julian," Elias said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous rumble. "That's the point. A man like me doesn't get to have a son. Every person I ever loved became a target the second I shook Sal Morty's hand. I gave you the only gift a man like me can give, a life without my shadow. My life is your shadow, Julian screamed, slamming his fist against the dashboard. Every birthday, every time I wondered why I looked like a man who didn't exist, that was you. I built something, I have a shop, I have friends, I have a name that I made for myself, and you just burned it all down in 20 minutes. You killed a man tonight back there, didn't you? I heard it. The scratching, the silence, you didn't even flinch. Elias banked the car hard around a corner, the tires protesting with a shrill cry. I didn't flinch because if I had, you'd be a corpse on a pallet right now. You think your self-made life was a secret. Every cent I ever sent your mother, every debt I paid off from the shadows, that was me. You weren't a mistake, Julian. You were the only thing in this world I ever did right, and now, because I wanted to retire, they're using that against me. The revelation hit Julian like a physical blow. He slumped back, his anger momentarily replaced by a sickening realization. So this is it. I'm just a bargaining chip, a final target to see if the old dog still has teeth. You're my son, Elias said, and for the first time his voice cracked, the granite facade showing a hairline fracture. And I am going to get you out of this city if I have to stack bodies to the moon to do it. You can hate me for the rest of your life. I expect you to. I want you to. But you're going to stay alive to do it. Julian looked out the window as they sped toward the darkness of the outer boroughs. The man sitting next to him was a stranger, a killer, and his father all at once. The resentment of 20 years hadn't vanished. It had merely evolved into something colder and more permanent. He looked at Elias' profile, the hard set of his jaw, the eyes that saw everything but felt nothing, and realized the tragedy of their reunion. To save the son, the father had to be the devil one last time. Don't expect a thank you, Julian whispered, his voice thick with a grief he couldn't name. I'm not looking for one, Elias replied, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror for the headlights of the inevitable pursuit. I'm looking for a way out. The static on the dashboard radio suddenly cut out, replaced by a low, rhythmic pulsing, the sound of a digital override. Elias didn't need to see the screen to know what was happening. In the world of the Morty family, there was a specific frequency reserved for the end of a man's life. Then, every burner phone in Elias' glove box began to chime in a discordant, mocking chorus. The red alert had been issued. It was the highest level of condemnation, a scorched earth policy that turned every soldier, every informant, and every desperate lowlife in the 5 boroughs into a bounty hunter. Elias Thorne, the silent hand, was no longer an asset. He was an infection that needed to be purged. What is that? Julian asked, his eyes darting to the vibrating glove box. Why is everything screaming? It's a manhunt, Elias said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He reached over, grabbed the burner phones, and hurled them one by one out the window into the rushing dark of the Brooklyn-Queens expressway. Sal just put a price on my head that could buy a city block, and since you're with me, you're part of the payout. He checked his mirrors. 3 sets of headlights were weaving through the late-night traffic behind them, moving with a synchronized, aggressive precision that didn't belong to civilians. They weren't hiding anymore. The pretense of a test was over. This was a slaughter. A black sedan lunged forward, clipping their rear bumper. The impact sent a shudder through the frame, making Julian cry out as he gripped the door handle. Elias didn't touch the brakes. He shifted down, the engine roaring in a violent mechanical protest, and rammed his steering wheel to the right, forcing the pursuer toward the concrete median. Sparks erupted like New Year's flares as metal ground against stone, but the second car was already closing the gap on his left. They're going to kill us, Julian gasped, the reality of the red mark sinking in. Your friends, your family, they're just going to run us off the road. They aren't friends, Julian. They're employees, and Sal just offered them a massive raise. A window on the lead car rolled down, and the stuttering flash of a submachine gun lit up the night. Bullets spider-webbed the rear glass rain showering the backseat. Elias shoved Julian's head down toward the floorboards. Stay down! Don't move until I tell you. Elias pulled a heavy .45 from his side holster, not even looking as he extended his arm at the driver's side window. He fired 3 timed shots, the recoil shaking his frame, but his eyes remained locked on the road ahead. He hit the lead car's front tire. The vehicle swerved violently, flipping twice before sliding into a bridge abutment in a bloom of orange flame. But for everyone he took down, two more seemed to emerge from the side streets. The city was waking up to the hunt. The Moretti network was vast. It lived in the kitchens of restaurants, the cabs of tow trucks, and the dark corners of every pier. By marking Elias red, Sal had turned New York into a labyrinth where every exit was being sealed with lead and iron. "We can't stay on the highway," Elias muttered, his mind racing through the map of a city he had spent 30 years memorizing. He took a sharp, screaming exit toward the industrial wasteland of the Navy Yard. "They have the cameras. They have the plate readers. We're driving a coffin." He looked over at Julian, who was curled in a ball, shivering. The boy's life, his bakery, his sketches, his peace, wasn't just gone. It had been incinerated. Elias felt a cold, sharp pang of something he hadn't felt in decades. Guilt. Not for the lives he had taken, but for the fact that he was the reason his son was now a ghost in waiting. "I'm sorry," Elias whispered, the words barely audible over the wind whistling through the shattered rear window. Julian didn't look up. He just gripped his knees tighter. Elias killed the headlights and drifted into a dark alleyway between two towering warehouses, the engine ticking as it cooled. The hunt was far from over. In fact, the night was just beginning to bleed. The sedan was a jagged wreck of Swiss cheese metal and shattered glass by the time Elias wrenched it into the shadow of an abandoned loading dock near the Broadway Lafayette station. He didn't turn off the engine. He let it die, a final wheeze of steam escaping the mangled radiator. "Out, now," Elias commanded, his voice a low, serrated edge. Julian stumbled from the passenger side, his boots crunching on glass. He looked up at the neon mouth of the subway entrance, the green globes flickering like the eyes of a sick animal. Behind them, the distant, rhythmic wail of sirens and the screech of tires signaled that the red hunters were closing the perimeter. They vaulted the turnstiles, Elias' hand a constant, guiding pressure on Julian's shoulder. The station was nearly empty, the air thick with the smell of ozone and damp concrete. They didn't wait for a train. Elias led him straight to the end of the platform, past the danger, high-voltage signs, and down into the pitch-black maw of the tunnels. "Stay between the rails," Elias whispered, the sound swallowed by the vast, echoing cavern. "Watch for the third rail. Touch it, and the mob won't need to finish the job." They ran, their footsteps splashing through oily puddles that never saw the sun. Behind them, the beam of a high-powered flashlight cut through the dark, sweeping the tunnel walls. Voices drifted down the shaft, harsh, impatient, and familiar. Sal's hitters weren't just following, they were flushing them out. A low, vibrating hum began to thrum through the soles of their boots. The walls started to sing. "Train, coming," Julian gasped, his lungs burning from the soot-heavy air. "Elias, the light." The single, blinding eye of a downtown 6 train rounded the curve, illuminating the tunnel in a terrifying, strobe-light frenzy. There was nowhere to go. The clearance between the train and the grime-slicked walls was a matter of inches. "Into the niche! Move!" Elias shoved Julian into a shallow maintenance alcove, a literal hole in the wall barely wide enough for 2 men. Elias pressed his body against Julian's, pinning him into the stone as the train roared past. The heat was immense, a wall of screaming metal and hot grease that threatened to suck them into the slipstream. Julian buried his face in Elias' jacket, his fingers digging into the leather. For 30 seconds, the world was nothing but thunder and the smell of burning dust. As the red taillights of the train faded into the dark, the silence that followed was even more dangerous. The flashlight beams behind them were closer now. "They saw us," Elias said, checking the load on his .45. "They know we're in the veins now." They reached a junction where the tracks split toward the lower east side. A figure stepped out from behind a steel support pillar, a young soldier named Rico, a kid Elias had seen rising through the ranks. Rico leveled a submachine gun, his face twisted in a mask of adrenaline and greed. Elias didn't hesitate. He fired twice before the kid could find his breath. The reports were deafening in the confined space, the muzzle flashes illuminating Julian's horrified face for a fraction of a second. Rico slumped against the pillar, his weapon clattering into the muck. "Keep moving," Elias growled, dragging a frozen Julian forward. "Don't look at him. He made his choice when he stepped into the tunnel." They scrambled up a rusted emergency ladder, the metal groaning under their weight. They emerged through a heavy steel grate into the basement of a derelict tenement building 3 blocks away. Elias kicked the grate shut and bolted it from the inside. Julian collapsed against a stack of rotting crates, his chest heaving. He looked at his father, the man who had just killed a boy barely older than Julian himself without a change in his pulse. "You're not saving me," Julian rasped, his eyes haunted by the flashes in the dark. "You're just dragging me into your grave." Elias didn't look back. He was already checking the perimeter of the basement, his mind moving 3 steps ahead. "The grave is already dug, Julian. I'm just trying to make sure only one of us stays in it." The basement of the upholstery shop in Bensonhurst smelled of linseed oil and gun grease, a scent that had anchored Elias' life for 30 years. Arthur, a man who looked like he had been carved out of a gnarled piece of oak, didn't look up from the sewing machine as Elias and Julian descended the rickety stairs. The rhythmic thwack-thwack-thwack of the needle through heavy leather was the only welcome they received. "I heard the chime on the red frequency, Elias," Arthur said, his voice a dry rasp. He finally stopped the machine and turned, his milky eyes scanning the 2 men. He lingered on Julian, his gaze softening with a pity that made Elias flinch. "I didn't think you had it in you to be this sloppy, or this sentimental." "I don't need a sermon, Artie," Elias said, his voice hollow. "I need the kit, the heavy stuff, and a clean car that isn't on the grid." Arthur stood up with a groan of protesting joints and limped toward a wall of fabric bolts. He shoved a massive roll of velvet aside, revealing a reinforced steel locker. "Sal is offering a seat at the high table for your head. You realize that, don't you? Every kid with a Saturday night special is looking for you. You're not just a target, you're a promotion." "Then they're going to have to earn it," Elias replied. Arthur threw open the locker. It wasn't an armory, it was a surgical suite for violence. He began pulling out items with a practiced, somber efficiency, a high-capacity tactical vest, ceramic plates capable of stopping a rifle round, and a suppressed short-barreled carbine. He laid them out on a worktable next to a stack of false IDs and a thick envelope of untraceable cash. Julian stood by the stairs, his arms wrapped around himself as if he were trying to hold his soul together. He stared at the weapons with a mixture of revulsion and awe. This was the inheritance he had never asked for, the cold, hard tools of a trade that had swallowed his father whole. "This is madness," Julian whispered, his voice cracking in the basement air. "We're just 2 people. You're talking about a war." Elias ignored him, checking the action on the carbine with a mechanical snap that echoed through the room. "Is the Mercury still in the garage?" "Fresh plates, full tank, and the engine been bored out." Arthur nodded toward a heavy metal door. "It's a ghost car. No GPS, no LoJack, but Elias, you know how this ends. You take this gear, you cross the line. There's no walking back to that quiet life upstate." Elias looked at his son, the boy who made bread, the man who drew people in parks. He saw the terror in Julian's eyes, but beneath it, he saw a flickering spark of the same iron that ran through his own veins. "I died the second I opened that envelope, Artie," Elias said, sliding a fresh magazine into his pistol. "I'm just making sure the bill gets paid." Arthur reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in a rag. He handed it to Julian. Julian unwrapped it to find a compact 9, its polymer frame cold and indifferent. "I don't want this," Julian said, his voice trembling. "Keep it," Elias said, not looking at him as he donned the tactical vest. "I hope to God you never have to pull the trigger, but if I go down, you don't get to be a pacifist. You get to be a survivor." Arthur watched them head toward the garage door, his expression unreadable. "Good luck, Elias. You were always the best of us. Pity you had to find a reason to live on the day you're supposed to die." The heavy door creaked open, revealing the matte black silhouette of the Mercury. Elias climbed into the driver's seat, the familiar cockpit of his true home. As Julian slid into the passenger side, clutching the wrapped gun like a cursed relic, Elias felt the weight of the night settling onto his shoulders. They weren't running anymore. They were arming for the end. The Mercury idled like a growling beast at the base of the Carrara Tower, a skeleton of glass and steel screaming 50 stories into the midnight sky. The penthouse was an open wound of exposed girders and dangling crane cables, a place where the wind howled with the voice of a ghost. Sal Morty didn't hide in bunkers. He sat on the edge of the world he built, waiting for the tribute he felt he was owed. "Stay in the car, Julian. If the lights go out in the lobby, drive. Don't look at the rear view," Elias said, his voice stripped of everything but the cold mechanical intent of a soldier. Julian grabbed his father's forearm, his fingers locking onto the tactical vest. "You're going to die up there. You know he's not alone." Elias looked at his son, really looked at him, for what felt like the first and last time. He reached out, his thumb tracing the same jawline he saw in the mirror every morning. "I've been dead for 30 years, Julian. Tonight is just the funeral." Elias stepped out into the biting wind, the suppressed carbine slung tight against his chest. The lobby was a tomb of marble and plastic sheeting. He didn't use the elevator. He took the service stairs, his lungs burning with a cold fire as he ascended the concrete heart of the building. By the 40th floor, the silence was broken by the distant, rhythmic thud of electronic music from Sal's private speakers above. He emerged onto the penthouse floor, a vast, roofless expanse of concrete overlooking the shimmering carpet of New York. Sal Morty sat in a lone leather armchair at the very edge of the precipice, a glass of amber liquid in one hand and a cigar in the other. 4 enforcers stood in the shadows of the support pillars, their silhouettes jagged against the city lights. "You're late, Elias," Sal called out, not turning around. "Vinny usually isn't that easy to kill. I suppose I underestimated the desperation of a father." Elias stepped into the center of the floor, his weapon lowered but ready. "The contract is void, Sal. You broke the code. You put blood on the ledger that didn't belong there." Sal stood up, the wind whipping his silk coat. He turned, his face a mask of disappointment. "The code is what I say it is. I gave you everything. I gave you a life, a name, and a retirement. All I asked for was the one thing you kept from me. You lied, Elias. You kept a piece of yourself off the books." "He's my son," Elias rasped. "He's a weakness," Sal countered, gesturing to his men. "And tonight we cut the cancer out." The shadows moved. The first enforcer lunged from behind a concrete pylon, but Elias was a blur of practiced violence. He pivoted, the carbine spitting 3 muffled coughs. The man folded before he could clear his holster. Elias didn't stop moving. He dove behind a stack of industrial drywall as a hail of gunfire chewed into the plaster, filling the air with a choking white dust. He tracked them by their muzzle flashes. He was a phantom in the haze, moving with a predatory instinct that bypassed thought. He took the second man with a precision shot through the neck and neutralized the third with a combat knife as they collided in the dark. But the fourth man, a brute named Marco, pinned Elias against a steel beam, his massive hands crushing Elias' throat. Elias felt the world fatting, the city lights blurring into a chaotic smear. He reached for his sidearm, but it was pinned. His fingers found the rag-wrapped 9 he had tucked into his waistband, the one Arthur had given to Julian, which Elias had quietly taken back. He pressed the muzzle into Marco's ribs and emptied the magazine. The weight lifted. Elias slumped to the floor, gasping for air, his vision clearing just in time to see Sal Morty standing over him, a gold-plated revolver aimed at his heart. "You were the best, Elias," Sal said, his voice almost mournful. "But even the best have to be put down when they start biting the hand that feeds." A sharp, metallic clack echoed from the stairwell. Sal froze, turning his head. Julian stood there, drenched in sweat and shaking, holding the heavy .45 Elias had left in the car. The boy's eyes were wide with a terror that had finally crystallized into a singular, desperate resolve. "Drop it," Julian shouted, his voice cracking but holding. "Drop it or I swear to God." Sal laughed, a dry, cruel sound. The baker has a rolling pin. Go home, kid, this is grown-up work. Sal began to turn his gun toward Julian. Elias didn't think. He lunged forward, his shoulder slamming into Sal's knees, sending them both tumbling toward the edge of the unfinished floor. There was no railing, only the 1,000-foot drop into the neon abyss. Elias grabbed Sal's lapels, locking his arms around the man who had been his master for 3 decades. Elias, no, Julian screamed. Elias looked back over his shoulder, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. It wasn't a look of defeat, it was a look of liberation. He had spent his life taking souls, it was finally time to offer his own. Go make the bread, Julian, Elias whispered. With a final, violent surge of strength, Elias threw his weight backward. The 2 men vanished into the night, falling into the glittering lights of the city like a pair of tumbling stars. Julian ran to the edge, his hands clutching the cold concrete, screaming into the wind. Below, there was only the indifferent hum of New York, a city that had swallowed a hitman and spat out a survivor. The wind at the Port Authority bus terminal was a different kind of cold. It didn't bite like the heights of the Carrara Tower. It just clung to the skin like damp wool. Julian stood by gate 42, his duffel bag slung over a shoulder that felt heavier than it had 24 hours ago. He stared at the 2 rectangular slips of paper in his hand, the blue ink of the destination, Burlington, Vermont, blurring under the harsh fluorescent hum of the terminal. He wasn't alone. Elias sat on a metal bench 3 feet away, his silhouette shrouded in a heavy wool overcoat Arthur had provided. One of his arms was tucked into the coat, stabilized by a makeshift sling, and a dark, jagged bruise bloomed across his cheekbone like a storm cloud. He looked smaller than he had in the tunnels, stripped of the tactical gear and the myth of the silent hand. He looked like a man who had finally hit the ground. The 415 is boarding, Elias said. His voice was a dry rattle, every word a visible effort. Julian didn't move. He looked at the man who had plummeted 50 stories and somehow caught a construction net 3 levels down, a man who had crawled back from the edge of hell just to find his son waiting at the service entrance. You killed him. You killed all of them. I closed the books, Elias replied, staring at a discarded newspaper on the floor. Sal, gone. The red alert died with him. The family will spend the next 10 years tearing itself apart over the throne. They won't be looking for a baker or a ghost. Julian sat down, leaving a careful, aching gap between them. He held out one of the tickets. Elias didn't take it immediately. He looked at the paper as if it were a foreign relic, something he didn't have the right to touch. You don't have to do this, Elias whispered. The money in that bag, it's enough to start over anywhere. You could go west. You could go back to school. You don't have to carry me with you. I'm not carrying you, Julian said, his voice hardening with a resolve that echoed the iron in his father's blood. But I'm not going back to being the kid who didn't know his own name. I have a lot of questions, Elias, and you're the only one left who can answer them. Elias finally reached out, his scarred fingers brushing Julian as he took the ticket. The contact was brief, but it was the first time they had touched without violence or desperation. It was the touch of 2 strangers realizing they shared the same skin. The bus hissed, its pneumatic doors swinging open with a rhythmic sigh. A line of tired travelers began to shuffle forward, people running away from debts, people running toward lovers, people just trying to disappear. Elias stood up, his movements stiff and pained, and waited. He didn't lead, he waited for Julian to take the first step. They boarded in silence, finding a seat in the very back where the shadows were deepest. As the bus pulled out of the terminal and onto the rain-slicked streets of Midtown, Julian watched the skyline of New York recede. The Carrara Tower was a distant, dark needle against the clouds, a tombstone for the life they were leaving behind. Julian leaned his head against the cold glass, closing his eyes. He thought of the bakery, the smell of vanilla, and the sketches of strangers. That life was a dream he had woken up from. Elias, Julian murmured, not opening his eyes. Yeah. Tell me about my mother. Tell me the truth, not the version you told yourself to sleep at night. Elias shifted in the seat, the springs groaning under his weight. He looked out at the dark expanse of the Hudson River, the city lights flickering out one by one as they crossed the bridge. For the first time in 30 years, he didn't check the mirrors. He didn't look for a tail. He just watched the road ahead, a long, black ribbon leading into a world where he was nobody. She liked the rain, Elias began, his voice low and steady. She said it was the only time the city felt clean. The bus sped north, carrying a killer and a baker into the dawn. They weren't a family yet, and they might never be. They were just two men sitting in the dark, beginning the long, quiet work of becoming human.